Today, let's talk about passing components as props in React. Imagine you have a model dialog component with some footer where you render an action button on the right. You want to use this dialog in multiple places throughout the app, and you want to be able to configure this button. Sometimes it will be different text, sometimes different color, or it may or may not have icon on the left. One way to do it, of course, would be just to pass this button configuration as props, where every prop controls different aspects of this button. But that's going to be quite cumbersome. What if we want to render two buttons there? Or add some text before the button that is also passed from the outside? Configuring this through props will be very complicated very soon. Not to mention that every time you want to add some new configuration, you would have to change the model dialog code. What we can do instead is just get rid of all those props and introduce another prop named footer. And to footer, we'll just pass components element, in our case, our button. Now, if we want to configure this button, we don't have to change a thing in the dialog. All the configuration will be passed to the button itself. Different texts, sizes, some text before the button, everything goes. This is a very powerful composition technique, passing components as props. It's very useful when you have a component that should position some other components, but it shouldn't really care what exactly it positions where. We can add more props to the dialog, like header, for example. We can implement something as big as a page component that implements generic 3 columns layout that we want to reuse on every page, and that has different content in those columns. Or we can go even as small as just a button with an icon component that accepts icon as a prop and positions it on the left of the content, properly aligned. Very flexible. However, one of the concerns with this pattern that people sometimes have is when exactly those components as props are going to be rendered. It's especially important for components like model dialog, which typically are rendered conditionally. If I render those footer, header, and content components inside a page like this, would it mean that page component will render them all the time, and as a result will become slower? Fortunately, there is no reason to be worried here. The page component doesn't actually render any of those. You see, when you do something like this, you are not actually rendering it. All that you do is just creating an element. Element is not a component, it's a component's definition. It's just an object that describes which component with which props and children should be rendered when this object ends up in the render tree. And it only ends up in the render tree when it actually is returned from a component that is rendered, not sooner. So in our case, header, footer, and content will be rendered only when the dialog itself renders, not before, which will happen only when this is open boolean returns true. Until then, both header and footer will just sit there quietly as objects and do nothing. Another common question with this pattern is, how do I set some default props to those components that are passed as props? If we were just implementing a button with an icon, for example, and imagine this button has appearance prop, which controls button size. The last thing that I want is just leave it to the consumer to always set proper size to the icon. They will get it wrong half the time. What I want is to have some way to control the icon inside the button, while still maintaining the flexibility of the pattern. This can be achieved with this little trick. When we receive the prop element, we can check whether it has the prop named size set, and then if the size is not set, we can clone the icon like this and set the size of the cloned icon inside the button itself. And of course, make sure to render the updated icon. Now, the icon will be large for large buttons by default, without the need for the consumer to worry about it. And if we really want to, we can always override it by passing different size to the icon explicitly. Very flexible and very convenient for the buttons consumers. One last thing. You might have read in the React docs that clone element is an anti-pattern. The reason for this is this function is just way too powerful. It allows you not only set defaults, but completely modify everything that you clone. Imagine what would have happened, for example, if we didn't check the icon props on the existence of size before cloning, and clone everything all the time. In this case, we would simply override the size prop on the icon all the time. So the consumer won't be able to control icon size anymore, without any indication to them at all. From their perspective, the size prop will just not work. So use this pattern carefully, just to set default values, and always make sure you don't override props that were set from the outside. If you don't like clone element pattern at all, there are other ways to pass components as props, like render functions or passing it as component itself, not element. But about those next time. If you want to play around with the code of those buttons and dialogues, link to the code sandbox is in the description. Also, if you would like to read more about this and similar patterns, there are links to some useful articles in the description as well. Hope this video was useful and see you next time.